Thank you very much, David. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining our weekly live video briefing today. We have the pleasure to welcome the legal advisor for UN Watch, Dina Rovner, who will give us an European perspective of the anti-Israel bias at the United Nations. In 1947, the newly created intergovernmental organization called the United Nations played a central role in the establishment of the Jewish state by passing UN Resolution 181, which called for the partition of British Mandate Palestine into two states, one Jewish state and one Arab state. Following its independence in 1948, Israel became an official member state of the international body. Yet, since its establishment, the UN has a decade-long history of a one-sided approach toward Israel. Arab member states regularly use the General Assembly as a forum for isolating and chastising the country. Under Agenda Item 7, Israel is the sole country discussed at the Human Rights Council, while all of the other 193 countries in the world are addressed under Agenda Item 4. No special agenda items are filled on Iran, Syria, North Korea, and other prominent human rights abusing countries. Given the configuration of majority of the UN, European opposition to this double standard would not in itself end that bias. But if Europe joined ranks with the US and other democratic countries like Canada, the UK, and Australia, they could deprive this bigoted resolution, which encourage anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, of their democratic legitimacy. Dina Rovner will help us to understand the background of this double standard and explain what organizations like UN Watch and ELNet, which have been partners for years, can do to get European countries to change their votes in the international organization. Dina Rovner, as I said, is the legal advisor for UN Watch. She appears at the UN and research and writes legal briefs, UN submissions, and report on human rights and the UN's bias against Israel. Prior to joining UN Watch, Dina worked for 5 years as a lawyer for Shurat Adin, representing victims of terrorism in lawsuits against state sponsors of terrorism and other defendants in the US court. So we prepared with Dina a bunch of questions to give you the opportunity to better understand what's going on this very technical issue, but we will try to make it clear for everybody. So Dina, let's go to our first question and give us please a background, try to provide us a background, a global overview of UN anti-Israel discrimination.
Yes, okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here. Yes, I think it's very helpful to start with an overview of the anti-Israel discrimination at the UN in terms of the resolution. So let me start with the General Assembly. The General Assembly has always adopted around 20 resolutions against Israel every year, and only 5 or 6 against the rest of the world combined, including human rights abusing dictatorships like Iran, Syria, and North Korea. So in the last couple of years, the number of resolutions against Israel has gone down. In 2020, there were 17 resolutions against Israel, and in 2021, there were 14 resolutions against Israel. And the reason for this is because European and Western countries have been pressuring the Palestinians to reduce the number of resolutions. But the numbers alone don't tell the whole story. They don't reveal the extent of the UN's irrational obsession with just one nation, Israel. The UN resolutions, the text, the language are biased and one-sided. So for example, one resolution uses only the Islamic term Haram al-Sharif to describe Jerusalem's Temple Mount, ignoring Jewish and Christian religion and history. And other resolutions about Palestinian rights condemn Israel while failing to mention Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Palestinian terrorism against Israeli civilians. The texts blame only Israel for a lack of peace and adopt the Palestinian narrative wholesale at the expense of legitimate Israeli rights. Other UN bodies, like the UN's 54-nation Economic and Social Council, condemn only one country at their annual meetings, Israel. Every year, ECOSOC, which is an abbreviation for the Economic and Social Council, adopts only 2 resolutions criticizing a country, of course, Israel. One of the resolutions, titled Situation of and Assistance to Palestinian Women, condemns Israel as the only violator of women's rights, giving a free pass to actual women's rights abusers like Saudi Arabia, where the male guardianship system gives male relatives the authority to make critical decisions about women, and also Iran, where a woman can be arrested, beaten, and brutalized for the crime of removing her hijab in public. Every year, the World Health Organization, WHO, condemns only one country, Israel. In condemning only Israel, the WHO ignores massive health crises around the world, like Syria's bombing of hospitals and medical convoys, and the mass hunger wrecking Venezuela as the country's healthcare system collapses, causing millions to flee. Even more, last year, during the WHO's annual meeting, the UN's top health agency deviated from addressing the global coronavirus pandemic to condemn Israel as the only country violator of health rights. And finally, we get to the Human Rights Council, which, as you know, is notorious for its selective condemnation of Israel and discrimination against the Jewish state. For now, I'll just focus on the resolutions, even though there are many more ways the Council discriminates against Israel. Each year, Israel is condemned at the Council in 5 resolutions, whereas some of the world's worst abusers like China, Cuba, Russia, and Saudi Arabia get 0 resolutions. Last year, under pressure from European and other Western countries, the Palestinians combined 2 of the resolutions so that there were 4 resolutions against Israel instead of the usual 5. To give you some idea of the numbers, in 2021, about 25% of the Council's condemnatory country resolutions were against Israel. Overall, since it was founded in 2006, more than 40% of the Council's condemnatory country resolutions have been against Israel. But it is not just the number of resolutions that give cause for alarm. Like I mentioned before, it's also their language. The language in the Human Rights Council's resolutions against Israel is different from all other resolutions. They are suffused with one-sided political hyperbole and systematically suppress any countervailing factors or context that might offer balance. And resolutions on other countries often contain praise and encouragement for the government. So there are countless resolutions adopted by the Council that praise bad countries, but one that sticks out is the resolution from 2009 on Sri Lanka, which was co-sponsored by China, Pakistan, Iran, Syria, and Sudan, that praised the country's promotion and protection of all human rights after government forces had killed an estimated 40,000 Tamil civilians. The Council's resolutions on Israel never contain a single word of praise. So that's just an overview of the anti-Israel discrimination that occurs all the time, every year at the UN.
Can you tell? Thank you very much. It's very interesting to begin with this global overview. It's frightening to see how many resolutions against Israel and solely against Israel. Okay, but can you tell us who is driving the targeting of Israel at the United Nations?
Sure, yeah. Well, clearly it's being driven by the Palestinians and their allies. The resolutions are written by the Palestinians, and the main sponsor of resolutions at the Human Rights Council is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, which is a group of 57 Muslim nations. So at the special session last May, for example, that session was called by Pakistan as president of the OIC and by the State of Palestine. Likewise, at the General Assembly, resolutions are sponsored by Palestine, together with Arab and other like-minded countries. Now, targeting Israel at international bodies is all part of the Palestinians' lawfare campaign, which uses the language and mechanisms of international law to delegitimize Israel. Since the Palestinians weren't successful in eliminating Israel on the battlefield in 1948 or in any of the wars that happened after, they're doing their best to turn Israel into a pariah state in the international community. And they use the UN resolutions and the UN fact-finding missions to fuel their case. So, for example, to supply evidence for their war crimes proceeding at the International Criminal Court. But these resolutions could not get adopted without the support of a majority of the UN's 193 member states, many of them non-democracies and human rights abusers themselves. So supporting this effort by the Palestinians and their allies are all the countries that vote in favor of the resolutions. Unfortunately, there is an automatic anti-Israel majority at the UN, as the late Israeli foreign minister and UN envoy Abba Eban famously said, and I'm sure you're familiar with this quote, if Algeria introduced a resolution declaring that the earth was flat and that Israel had flattened it, it would pass by a vote of 164 to 13 with 26 abstentions. The same is true today. If the Palestinians get a resolution on the table, it is almost certain to pass. And who supports these resolutions? Well, you have the non-aligned movement, which is a bloc of 120 developing nations, and it includes many dictatorships and non-democracies like China, Cuba, and Venezuela. And there are also some democracies that side with the Palestinians, like South Africa and some Latin American countries. And of course, the European countries also go along with this. So I'll get into this a bit more later. But one of the obvious explanations for this, of course, is anti-Semitism. As you probably know, according to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, applying double standards to Israel by requiring of Israel behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation is a form of anti-Semitism. And that is exactly what is happening at the UN today.
Thank you, Dina. We are surprised that every year the same resolutions are adopted by the United Nations. What is for? Why coming back every year with the same resolution?
Yeah, well, this is typical of the UN. In many cases, UN resolutions are annual. For example, there are certain thematic resolutions that get adopted every year, or country-specific resolutions like on Iran and North Korea, which they come up every year. And there's a certain momentum for this type of annual action. But it is not automatic, and it can change. If a resolution is put on the table, it means that countries want it there. So with respect to the Israel resolutions, it's because the Palestinians want the resolutions, the Islamic states want the resolutions, and the Europeans seem to support them. Sometimes on very small issues, the Europeans push back, but in general, they don't. So this means that the Europeans are part of the demand for these resolutions. Now, I will add that in the past few years, the number of resolutions, like I said, has gone down. And the Israeli Foreign Ministry deserves credit for its diplomatic efforts in this regard. And UN Watch's work in exposing the bias and discrimination also plays a role in this. I mean, every year we put out press releases and we are very active on social media, exposing how the UN adopts 19 or 17 resolutions on Israel and only one each on a handful of other countries, and none on many egregious violators like China, Cuba, Turkey, Pakistan. But what's happened at the General Assembly is that some of the resolutions were combined, some were eliminated, and some were made biannual. And I'll get a little bit more into this a bit later. But so this year, there were only 14 resolutions on Israel instead of 17 or 19. And there are also similar efforts at the Human Rights Council, in that direction.
Tell us a little bit more, please, about this famous or infamous Chapter 7 of the Human Rights Council agenda. To what extent is this an exception and a mere example of discrimination, and how has it evolved?
Yeah, well, actually, the agenda item 7 is quite interesting. It's the Human Rights Council's agenda item devoted exclusively to Israel. It is something unique to the Human Rights Council. You don't have this at the General Assembly or at the other UN bodies that I mentioned. And it's probably the best known example of the Human Rights Council's singling out of Israel. So the Human Rights Council has 10 agenda items. And these were set as part of the institution building package adopted as Human Rights Council Resolution 5/1 in June 2007, just after the Human Rights Council was created. So all the other agenda items are general. No other agenda item singles out a specific country or human rights situation. For example, we have agenda item 4, which is human rights situations that require the Council's attention. And this is where all other countries are criticized, like Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Then you have item 10, which is technical assistance and capacity building. And generally speaking, this is not meant to be critical, but more about how the UN can provide resources and assistance to countries. And there are many African countries that are addressed under this agenda item, and some other countries as well. And then we have item 2, which is the annual report of the High Commissioner. And the High Commissioner reports on different country situations. So it's kind of another opportunity to deal with countries. And sometimes it can offer a diplomatic way out for countries who strongly oppose being discussed under agenda item 4, let's say, but they don't really fit in under agenda item 10. So with regard to agenda item 7, as I said, it's unique and it's discriminatory. And the Western democracies, the United States, Canada, Australia, UK, and most of Europe, boycott this agenda item, this debate on principle. But let me say a few words about how agenda item 7 has evolved, because some things are starting to change a little bit at the Human Rights Council. And we know actually that one of the reasons why the US left the council under Donald Trump had to do with the discrimination against Israel and this agenda item 7. So the latest tactic by the Palestinians has been to move some resolutions from agenda item 7 to agenda item 2, which, as I said, is the annual report of the High Commissioner. By taking the resolutions out of agenda item 7, they hope to gain the support from the EU and Western democracies who oppose item 7 on principle. Now, they started with this in 2019 with the annual Israel Accountability Resolution, which endorses biased UN fact-finding missions like the Goldstone Report. And last March at the 46th session, the Palestinians added to this the resolution on human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. So basically, they combined 2 resolutions, the Accountability Resolution and the Human Rights Resolution, that were originally under item 7, and they put them together as one resolution under item 2, one combined resolution, with the aim of getting more support from European countries. And what this meant was that the total number of resolutions against Israel was reduced from 5 to 4, and of these, only 3 were under agenda item 7. Unfortunately, most European countries supported the combined item 2 resolution, or they abstained. So it did have an impact on votes, the Palestinians' tactic. Now, the United States, in its key outcomes document from the 46th session, described this change in a positive way. It said, quote, during HRC 46, 2 resolutions were merged under agenda item 2, resolutions on accountability and the human rights situation in the Palestinian territories, leaving only 3 resolutions in agenda item 7. Israeli settlements, self-determination for Palestinians, and human rights in the Golan. But this is a distortion. The change benefits only the Palestinians, not Israel, because by combining the resolutions, the Palestinians were able to get the Europeans to vote for the accountability resolution, which in the past they had mostly abstained on. And also, it creates a proliferation of discussions on Israel at the Human Rights Council under both agenda item 2 and item 7. So it's not like the Palestinians got rid of agenda item 7, which was one of the main issues that the United States had with the Human Rights Council. And they didn't just move Israel to a generic agenda item. Instead, they created 2 discussions on Israel, one under agenda item 2, which is at the opening of the session, and another one under agenda item 7 towards the end of the session. So I'd like to look for a moment at what happened with the UK vote, because I think this is really interesting. In 2017, the UK started changing its votes on Israel at the Human Rights Council. And it started by voting no to the Golan resolution. And then it said that if things didn't change, it would start voting no on all of the item 7 resolutions. So then in 2018, it voted no. It added a no vote also to the accountability resolution. meaning it voted no to the Golan Resolution and to the Accountability Resolution. And then in 2019, the Palestinians moved the Accountability Resolution to Agenda Item 2. They moved it out of Item 7. And what happened was that the UK, instead of voting no, they abstained on the resolution. But they still voted no to all of the Item 7 resolutions, saying Item 7 represents systematic institutional bias, which it does. So what we see is it does have an impact on votes, unfortunately. And we see now that the Palestinians are using Item 2 more and more. For instance, with the latest Commission of Inquiry, they have put the Commission's report, which will be presented in June, under Agenda Item 2. So that's kind of how things are changing at the Human Rights Council in this regard.
You spoke about UK, but are there significant split between European countries when it comes to vote on these resolutions?
Yeah, so actually that's a very interesting question. And it's one of the topics that is covered in our database, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But if we review the European votes in the different UN bodies, we can start with the General Assembly. And there, Europe votes mostly as a bloc. It's more than 70% against Israel. And I'll just give you some examples of how there are some splits. Hungary and the Czech Republic do vote slightly better than the rest of Europe. For example, this year they voted no on the Jerusalem resolution, which refers to the Temple Mount only by its Muslim name, Haram al-Sharif, whereas the rest of Europe voted yes or abstained. Also, on the resolution that perpetuates the bias mandate of the Special Committee to investigate only Israeli actions against the Palestinians, the Czech Republic and Hungary voted no this year, and Austria and Slovenia also joined in that no vote, but the rest of Europe abstained. And Hungary also votes no on some other resolutions. But the biggest voting change in Europe over the last couple of years at the General Assembly has been that several countries changed their votes from abstain to no on 2 resolutions, which actually didn't come up for a vote this year. The first is the resolution perpetuating the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which is one of the veteran pillars of the UN's anti-Israel infrastructure. And it's the only UN committee devoted to a single cause and completely ignores Palestinian violations. The second is the resolution perpetuating the division of Palestinian rights, which serves the biased special committee to investigate Israeli actions that I just mentioned earlier, and it's dedicated to spreading anti-Israel propaganda. So EU countries that are now voting no on both of these resolutions are Austria, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Germany, and Hungary. And a number of other European countries now vote no just to one of the resolutions, the division of Palestinian rights. And those countries are Denmark, Estonia, Greece, Lithuania, Netherlands, Slovakia, and Slovenia. So France and the UK abstain on these resolutions. Now, as I said, because the resolutions were made biennial, they didn't come up for a vote this year, and that's one of the reasons why we had only 14 resolutions. But if you look at some of the other UN bodies, like at the World Health Organization, also you see the Europeans kind of sticking together, but with some divergence. So until 2017, Europe, including the UK, voted as a bloc in favor of the annual WHO resolution. Then in 2017, a handful of countries broke away from the bloc and abstained. Those were Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, and Latvia. And the UK also began voting no in 2017. In 2018, so more European countries abstained. And in 2019, some of the countries also joined the UK in voting no. In 2021, this past year, Austria and the Netherlands also joined in the no vote on the WHO resolution, but France votes yes on that resolution, okay? So you see the Europeans are a bit more split at the WHO, but at the Economic and Social Council, there are 2 resolutions there. And there's one resolution on Palestinian women and another one on economic and social repercussions of the Israeli occupation. So on the second resolution, economic and social repercussions of the Israeli occupation, the Europeans, including the UK, they all vote yes, which is a vote against Israel. But on the first resolution concerning Palestinian women, the Europeans either abstain or vote yes. And Germany and the UK are among the countries that abstain. Now, since ECOSOC has only 54 members, it's not the full UN membership, so not all European countries are voting every year. But what we see is an interesting trend that, unlike at the WHO, where more countries have been voting to support Israel, here, at least on the Palestinian Women Resolution, some of the countries' votes have gotten worse. So, for example, where France, Ireland, and Spain, they used to abstain on this Palestinian Women Resolution, and recently they have been voting yes, which is a vote against Israel. On the other hand, the Netherlands, just this year, they changed their vote, their yes vote, to abstain. So there is not 100% consistency between the Europeans. And if I'll just say a few words about the Human Rights Council resolutions, because here you also see this dynamic where there are 5 resolutions, and the Europeans do mostly vote as a bloc, but they're split on some of the resolutions. So on the Golan resolution, for example, since 2018, the Europeans have all voted no. And this is a resolution that accuses Israel of violations against the Syrian citizens of the Golan Heights and rejects as illegal Israel's annexation of that territory, but completely ignores Syrian violations against its own citizens. And on this resolution, the Europeans are pretty much together, they vote no. But on the Palestinian self-determination resolution, also the Europeans mostly vote together. Yes, they vote in favor, but the Czech Republic and the UK vote against that resolution. And then you have the settlements resolution, which denies the rights of Israeli Jews in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. And here again, Czech Republic and the UK are the only countries that vote no. And then there are some countries, Austria and Bulgaria, which abstain, but the rest of Europe, they all vote yes. Okay, and then what we have is the annual human rights resolution, where the Europeans, except the UK, have all voted together in support, meaning against Israel. They vote yes to that resolution. There was some change in the year that we held in 2019, when UN Watch organized a rally in Geneva. Then some countries did, they either voted no or abstained, but that was just during that 1 year. And then there's the accountability resolution, which was moved to item 2, as I mentioned. So Australia, Austria, and Bulgaria vote no on this resolution. And like I said, the UK did vote no originally when it was in item 7, but then once it was removed, it was changed and was moved over to item 2, then they abstained. And then you have what happened this year, where the Palestinians combined the human rights resolution with the accountability resolution. And they did that specifically because they knew that the Europeans historically support the human rights resolution. So they figured if they combine that with the accountability resolution, then the Europeans are likely to vote yes to that resolution. And it worked, because countries that had abstained in 2020 voted yes to that resolution in 2021. So that's kind of an overview of the European votes.
So how do you account for the differences among European countries?
Well,
what's making the difference?
Yeah, well, I mean, on many votes, the EU imposes discipline. Okay, so that's kind of like a whip in American politics, which keeps all the countries in line with the bloc. Okay, so on a number of votes, Brussels will impose a common position, and then if countries veer off that common position, they would get into trouble. And you saw this in 2012, when the Czech Republic voted no on General Assembly Resolution 6719, which is the resolution that gave the Palestinians non-member observer status at the UN. The other countries, the other European countries, voted yes or abstained. And ahead of the vote, the EU High Representative Catherine Ashton made the EU position clear. She said that the EU had repeatedly expressed its support and wish for Palestine to become a full member of the United Nations as part of a resolution to the conflict. So over time, the Czech Republic was kind of brought back in line through pressure from Brussels. And so what you see is that even EU countries like the Czech Republic and Hungary, which are more friendly to Israel, they have to pick their battles. They cannot veer off the EU party line all the time. So they support Israel on some of the more extreme anti-Israel resolutions, but otherwise they go along with the party. Now, why are these countries different? Well, there could be a lot of reasons for that. I mean, it is known that some countries like Ireland and France, they hate Israel more, and other countries like the Czech Republic and Hungary are more friendly. But there are other factors. You know, there is Israeli diplomacy, which also has an impact. Some countries have a stronger pro-Israel lobby. Also, Israel can trade votes, meaning it can give a country something in exchange for a positive vote. There could be some resolutions like what we saw with the WHO and ECOSOC, where, you know, there's more of a split because maybe the EU doesn't impose its discipline on those resolutions. And I would also just point out that you can see the EU positions on Israel, not just through votes, but also through their speeches. Because, for example, like I said, the EU boycotts Agenda Item 7 on principle. But some countries like Ireland and Luxembourg still insist on speaking during that debate. And that makes a very strong statement for a country to go against EU policy and participate in Agenda Item 7. So
now I have perhaps the most politic question. What determines EU voting policy? Who instructs the ambassador in New York or Geneva? Why do the Europeans support the Palestinians at the UN? And what do they gain from this? This is my best question.
Yeah, well, okay, those are very, it's very interesting. It's a good question. And it's quite interesting. So the way it works is, as a general rule, like I said, EU positions and voting policy at the UN are decided by the EU Council in Brussels. The EU has permanent observer status at the General Assembly and most of the UN specialized agencies, and it has its own representatives at the UN in New York and at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So this gives it the right to speak on behalf of the EU at UN meetings and also to introduce and sponsor resolutions at the UN. And you see the EU kind of acting as its own entity. So at the Human Rights Council, there's one EU country that's designated as the EU chair, and that changes every 6 months. And then that country is the one that speaks on behalf of the EU at the council. Now, if you look at the votes, like I said, the overall policy is determined by the EU, but each country, on a practical level, each country receives instructions from its capital. So the ambassadors vote based on instructions from home. But the EU member states, they do have a joint negotiating and voting strategy. And working together under the EU rubric, they can actually influence the draft language of resolutions. So, for example, on its Foreign Office website, Germany celebrates that together with other EU states, it succeeded in reducing the total number of resolutions on Israel at the General Assembly and in improving the texts, and that this enabled it to vote in favor of most of the resolutions, which it says it votes based on various considerations. So it abstained on the Jerusalem resolution, even though many EU countries voted in favor, but it voted yes on the resolution on peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine because a line was added to that resolution condemning rocket attacks on Israel. And in the Netherlands, in July 2019, after we exposed that they had supported one of the ECOSOC resolutions against Israel, a cross-party coalition of Dutch MPs challenged the government position in parliament. The next year, the Netherlands broke away from the EU position, so they didn't follow the EU common position, and they abstained on the ECOSOC resolution on Palestinian women. Now, you asked, what do the Europeans gain from this? And I think this is probably the most important part of the question. And there are many factors at play here. So there could be real politic interests. For example, in the beginning of in the early 1970s, the European countries were moving closer to the Arab countries for oil. And so during the Yom Kippur War, the Arab states used their oil as a weapon to prevent countries from supporting Israel. And ultimately, they actually punished the United States, the Netherlands, and some other countries with an oil embargo because those countries had supported Israel. Another factor, of course, is money. Arab states could offer to invest in countries that vote in their favor. And like I mentioned earlier, there's vote trading, meaning if your country votes for me on this resolution, then I will vote for you on your resolution. But, and I touched on this a little bit in the beginning, there is also something more profound. It's more psychological and less rational, and that, of course, is anti-Semitism. So the EU countries, they seem to enjoy condemning the Jewish state. And it's naive to think of the EU just as a passive player, like they're just going along with it, because if they don't like something, then they should speak up. And it's not, and it's more than just about their UN votes, because you can see their policy through their actions in other areas. So if we take a look at the bigger picture of EU policy on Israel, which also affects what happens at the UN, for example, we see that the EU does not criticize UNRWA. It supports it. Germany, the EU, and the UK were UNRWA's top 3 donors before the US resumed funding last year. And the EU also gives tens of millions of dollars to anti-Israel organizations such as Al-Haq and B'Tselem, which feed material to UN bodies and mechanisms like the Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Michael Link, and the different commissions of inquiry, which produce very damaging reports against Israel. And what happens is that these reports, which these European-funded NGOs are supplying the information for, then they get stamped with the imprimatur of the UN, and that gives them legitimacy. And then all of this is fueling the pursuit of Israel at the ICC. So to a large degree, many, if not most, of the European countries, as part of their policy, are supporting this. They're supporting the anti-Israel cause. And we know this has always been an internal battle among different elements in these countries. For example, if you look at the Dreyfus affair in France in 1900, of course, there was the anti-Semitic element that wanted to condemn Dreyfus, and then the other half of the country that saw this as unjust. And, you know, just a few years ago, even now in the UK, I mean, there was a moment when Jeremy Corbyn, who considers Hamas and Hezbollah to be friendly social justice groups, was head of the Labour Party. But there are also other parties that are more friendly to Israel. And in Canada, under Prime Minister Harper, the foreign policy was very pro-Israel. But under Trudeau, I mean, it still is, but a bit less. And even despite all of this tension, you still see the constant that these countries give millions of dollars to the network of anti-Israel NGOs and to UNRWA. And so it's not just their UN votes, but it's the overall policy that seems to be supporting this.
As I know that we have a few questions from our audience, and we still have few questions that I would like to ask you. We will accelerate a little bit. The next question is, can the US influence the European vote? You can respond by yes or no.
Okay, so I'll respond by yes or no. I'll say yes, they can. But it goes both ways. Europe also can influence the US.
Do mechanisms of cooperation exist to influence European vote regarding Israel?
I don't think there's any, it's hard for me to say there's like an organized mechanism of cooperation. We know there is for the Palestinians. There's this pro-Palestinian lobby in Europe. It's called the European Middle East Project. It's a very powerful pro-Palestinian lobby. In terms of the pro-Israel mechanisms of cooperation, I'm not aware specifically. UN Watch has its, we have our own initiatives. And I mentioned one of them, that's our database. So I will say a few words about that because it's a very powerful advocacy tool, and you can find it at www.unwatch.org/database. And we have a take action button, which is allows people to sign petitions to their foreign ministers of their own country, calling on them to change votes. And this is a very powerful tool that we should all be using more. And it also has information about countries. So, you know, you can click on a country and get information. And we have a nice video on YouTube that kind of explains how it all works, and it walks you through the website. But you can see how countries vote, which countries are members of different UN bodies and how they vote on Israel resolutions. And it provides a lot of data.
So two more questions, Dina. Are there early warning mechanisms among the pro-Israel community to influence UN votes?
So I don't think there's anything really official, but we do get draft resolutions sometimes, and we are happy to partner with different organizations and be part of that effort. It works best if you focus if you stay focused on on one small issue, like we've been successful in bringing change at the World Health Organization, or with Durban last year. This was like kind of a concerted campaign that a bunch of different groups worked on, and in the end we got 38 countries to pull out. You have those two resolutions where European countries some of them have started to change their votes, and that's due mostly to Israeli diplomatic efforts, but they have to work. But if you want to bring a change like that, let's say your country hasn't changed its vote yet on those resolutions, then it's best to have groups in your country working with the Israeli government together in a coordinated way to help bring change. And we can try to facilitate, or we can assist with that if there's
okay. So my last question, and you will have 3 minutes to answer before the second part that will be shorter, to give the opportunity to our audience to ask some more questions. So my question is, what are the next campaigns of UN Watch that Elnet and other groups could support, and what can be done to get European countries to change their vote in the United Nations organization?
Okay, so the next big campaign that we have is against the Commission of Inquiry. And I'll just say a few words about why this Commission of Inquiry is so bad. It's been called an inquisition. This is something new. It was created last May. And unlike past commissions of inquiry, it's not limited in time. It has no end date. It goes on forever. Also, the mandate is very broad. It goes back. It says anything leading up to April 13th, 2021 and after. So it can go back to 1948, before, it can go indefinitely into the future. And it's not just looking at war crimes, but also at root causes, systematic discrimination. It's trying to lead the UN to issue another report condemning Israel for apartheid. It's trying to collect evidence that it will present to the ICC. And we know that the commissioners of inquiry are completely biased. UN Watch just submitted a legal brief asking for the chair of the commission, Navi Pillay, to step down because of her bias. And I'll just give a few examples. I mean, you might remember her as being a chief defender of the anti-Semitic Durban process. She has defended Agenda Item 7. She said that Israel was treating international law with perpetual disdain. That was after the 2010 flotilla incident. Recently, she has called Israel apartheid. She's actually said Israel, she has signed letters to stop Israel apartheid, and accused it of systematic discrimination. So one of the things that UN Watch is very active in combating this Commission of Inquiry. We have some things planned on this, and we'll be doing more as the commission prepares to present its report to the Council in June. And we think that EU countries should have a long-term goal to end the Commission of Inquiry. So in the short term, they should prioritize making statements on the record, criticizing and opposing it, just like the new US ambassador to Geneva, Michelle Taylor. She said last week during her confirmation hearing that she would tirelessly underscore the US objection to the open-ended Commission of Inquiry targeting Israel. And it's very important for EU countries to also make similar statements. And then in terms of what we can do next, I mean, getting European countries to change their positions really is quite difficult. But if, pro-Israel groups in the country, if local communities working together with the Israeli diplomats, choose a few focused issues, then they can bring about change. It means getting allied MPs on their side, bringing up these issues in Parliament, speaking with the foreign minister. And, we also have our petitions on our website that can be helpful. And we're also happy to speak in EU parliaments and with MPs on these issues.